Mr. President, this is an important day in the United States Senate because we're debating an important issue. It's one the country cares about and should care about. It's a one into which a great many number of the senators here on both sides of the aisle have discussed. I want to congratulate Senator Warner and Senator Lieberman for their leadership. The chairman of the committee is here. She's worked diligently on this and made it a priority. We're doing what the Senate ought to do. What the American people don't like is when they see us engaged in petty, what I like to call playpen politics, when we, start trying to see who can stick fingers in each other's eyes. What they do like to see us do is have principled, vigorous debates about important issues that have to do with the future of our country, and how we deal with climate change is surely one of those issues. And that is the way we're approaching this. I mean, we voted to move to proceed by a large margin, Democrats and Republicans both, to say this is important enough to put on the floor. The majority leader apparently is giving us a significant amount of time to debate this, as we say in Tennessee, to air out the issues, and that's surely what we ought to do. We began this morning in a bipartisan breakfast. Senator Lieberman and I are the hosts, along with some others, of a bipartisan breakfast on Tuesday mornings. The presiding officer often attends those meetings as well, and the purpose of that was for Democrats and Republicans to sit around a table in a room with no staff, no media, and discuss issues about which we don't agree, in hopes we can find a way to deal with it. So this is an important day in the United States Senate. We're doing exactly what we ought to be doing on an issue of importance to the American people. And the Lieberman-Warner bill is the basis for this discussion. Now, we're going to be hearing this week a lot of criticisms of the Lieberman-Warner bill, and I'm going to make some of them myself. But that is not to criticize the effort, because we have to start somewhere. And these are two of our most distinguished members. It's gone through the committee and it's now on the floor. But we'd be derelict if we didn't say, let's deal with climate change in the correct way. So what I'd like to do in the time I have remaining is to talk about three things that I see that are wrong with this bill. Number one. Number two is to suggest a better way to deal with the climate change issue. And number three, to suggest what I believe is the best way to deal with the entire range of issues that are presenting us, which I believe are much larger than climate change. In other words, and I'll jump to the end of my remarks at the beginning by simply saying I believe that climate change is a real issue, that humans are a contributor to climate change, and we must deal with it. But I also believe that an unusual demand for energy in the United States and the world is a real issue. In our region, where the Tennessee Valley Authority produces about... Senator's rebuttal time has expired. I thank the chair. In our region, where the Tennessee Valley Authority produces about 3% of all the electricity in the country, the estimates are that we'd need 700 new megawatts of power in the next year. That's a coal plant and a half, and that means 30 new coal plants around the country, or 40 just to meet that if the rest of the country's like TVA. So that's a real issue as well. Our over-reliance on oil from other countries is a huge issue for us. We don't like being in the pocket of people some of whom are trying to kill us, who are selling us oil. We want to be more independent than that in the world, and it affects almost every aspect of our national security. It's costing us $500 American a year. Overdependence on oil is driving down the value of the dollar. That lack of independence in our supply is a major issue. Clean air is an issue. Carbon is not the only pollutant in the air that I'm concerned about coming from Tennessee, nor would it be from a senator from California either. We have a real concern about sulfur and nitrogen and mercury, and I have since I've been in the Senate. First with Senator Carper, supported legislation in a bipartisan way to stiffen requirements on mercury, nitrogen, and sulfur, as well as begin to cap power plant emissions for carbon. So that's a little different perspective as well than just saying carbon is a problem, that's the only problem. So there are a range of problems we need to deal with, and my preference, as I will say in my remarks, is that we should have a new Manhattan Project for clean energy independence. That is the real way to deal with high gas prices, high electric prices, climate change, clean air, and the national security implications of too much dependence on foreign oil. But let me go back to the beginning and start with some problems with this bill. What's wrong with Warner-Lieberman? The first thing wrong is that the Warner-Lieberman bill, according to the Environmental Protection Agency analysis, would increase the tax on gasoline per gallon by 53%, 53 cents by the year 2030, and another 90 cents or so after that. A 53-cent per gallon gas tax increase according to the Environmental Protection Agency. That's not the Republican policy group speaking, that's the Environmental Protection Agency. And Mr. President, I propose when the opportunity comes to offer an amendment to strike from the bill the provisions that put a 53-cent gas tax increase on the American people at this time. That's the first thing wrong with the bill. Second thing wrong with the bill is that the Environmental Protection Agency says that 53-cent gas tax increase may hurt the pocketbook of the American consumer, but it won't reduce the carbon. It's not enough. It's not enough to cause people to drive much less, and it's an ineffective way to do what the sponsors of the bill want to do. So we would have the worst of both worlds. We'd be increasing the gas tax by 53 cents, and we wouldn't be doing what we aim to do, which is to reduce carbon with that effort. And the third thing wrong with the bill is it creates, over the next 10 years, and these are according to CBO analyses, no one disputes this, I don't think, what I would call a $1 trillion slush fund. It would collect money in the form of, in effect, a carbon tax through a cap-and-trade system on the entire economy of the United States and bring it to Washington, D.C., where members of Congress would, over the next 40 years, have created about 42 mandatory entitlement spending programs for that money. Nothing is more dangerous in Washington, D.C. than a $1 trillion trust fund with a group of congressmen with an idea about how to spend it. And my cure for that, and I think there will be amendments to this effect, is that to the extent there is any money brought in to Washington as a result of a cap-and-trade auction, whether it's just on power plants or the whole economy, that money ought to be returned directly to the taxpayers, especially the working people who will be having to pay for the higher electric rates or the higher gas prices. So those are three problems I have with the bill. The 53-cent per gallon gas tax increase, number one. That's what the EPA says. I don't think anyone doubts that. Number two, it doesn't work because the EPA also says, and so does other testimony before the committee of which Senator Boxer is chairman, has indicated that an economy-wide cap on fuel is not an effective way to reduce the amount of carbon produced, at least in the early years. And the third is the $1 trillion slush fund for congressmen and women to come up with their own great idea. Uncle Sam's got an idea about creating a bonfire in the backyard and recapturing the carbon. Let's put $500,000 for that and make an earmark of that and spend money on it for 40 years. I can't think of a worse way to spend money. So it's well-intentioned, but the bill as it has grown has become, in effect, with all respect, a well-intentioned contraption. And it creates boards and czars and commissioners and money, and it's too complicated. It's too expensive. It has the potential for too many surprises. It overestimates what we in the United States Congress have the wisdom to do in writing legislation about an economy that produces 30% of all the wealth in the world every year and uses 25% of the energy. This is a very complex free market economy that we have here, and we have to be very careful about how we affect it. Now, having said that, would there be a better way to deal with climate change? The answer, Mr. President, is I believe so, and I'd like to say briefly what I think that is. I believe it would be to put a cap-and-trade system on power plants alone That's 40% of the carbon produced in the American economy. And a low-carbon fuel standard on fuel. A low-carbon fuel standard being very simply the idea that beginning in the year 2023, which is already in this proposed legislation, it would control the amount of carbon that fuel in cars and trucks could produce, and that's it. In other words, instead of putting cap and trade on the whole economy, only on power plants, nothing else, and use a different approach for fuel. Now, why would cap and trade work for power plants? Well, we have a lot of experience with cap and trade for power plants. Cap and trade is simply a system of saying limits on the amount of carbon that come out of the smokestacks at power plant, if it's a coal plant, or whatever kind of plant it might be. We have experience with measuring that. We actually have measurements for sulfur, nitrogen, now mercury. We could do it for carbon. We could select effective enforcement dates that had some realistic relationship to the development of technology. For example, the technology to recapture the carbon that comes out of coal plants. And in doing so, I believe that could be an effective way to begin to control the amount of carbon that's produced by the method of doing that in the United States. It produces 40%, the power plants. Would it add to the cost of electricity? Yes, it would. And what would we do with the credits that were auctioned if there were a cap and trade system? We would give the money back, not through a lot of programs, not to the state government, not to pet projects. We give it straight back to the people who pay electric rates, because the working people who do that would be the one who would have those higher rates. That would leave manufacturers alone. It wouldn't drive them overseas. It would avoid setting up all these boards and commissions and czars and government bureaucracy. And then what would we do about fuel? Well, already, Mr. President, we've done the single most important thing we could do as a Congress for climate change when we passed the fuel efficiency standards at the end of last year. We did that in a bipartisan way, too. We increased by 40% the fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks in the United States for the first time in over 30 years. In 2007, we did that. Testimony from David Green of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory said that's the single most important thing the Congress can do to deal with climate change, overdependence on foreign oil, or clean air. And we did it. That's the first thing. But there's another step we could do. And that is already in this bill. It's the low-carbon fuel standard that I talked about a few moments ago. As it's now presented in the bill, it would require fuel suppliers to lower the carbon content of transportation fuels by 5% less per unit of energy in 2023 and 10% less in 2028. The advantage of that, unlike the cap and trade system, which is ineffective in terms of reducing carbon in fuel, this would be 100% effective because it would require a certain amount of reduction. Second, it's the way we normally deal with fuel and pollution. For example, the low sulfur fuel standards for big trucks that the Clinton EPA started and the Bush EPA finished is making a big difference in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee by reducing the amount of sulfur in the air starting this year. That is a form of fuel standard. This would be a low-carbon fuel standard, just like the low-sulfur fuel standard is for big trucks. It's simple. There'd be a timeline that we could prepare for, and it might lower gasoline prices rather than adding 53 cents to the price per gallon of gasoline as the current legislation would, because if you know that there needs to be a low-carbon fuel standard, then you might, for example, choose electricity as a fuel and have a plug-in hybrid vehicle, and that would reduce the amount of carbon for the fuel. Or you might advance research for crops that we don't eat, like cellulosic ethanol, and use more of that kind of fuel. But we wouldn't have senators and congressmen and people who are elected to office making judgments about picking and choosing winners and losers. So if you're asking me how I would do it, I would say, and I would imagine that if we look ahead a couple of years and had to guess today what kind of climate change legislation might actually pass the United States Senate, the United States House, and be signed by a president. I think it will be a very simple piece of legislation, probably cap and trade for power plants, with effective dates regulated or adjusted to the development of technology that would permit power plants to meet the standards. And then for fuel, it would be the fuel efficiency standards we already have, plus a low carbon fuel standard. That would cover 2/3 of the carbon that we produce in the United States. The current bill only presumes to cover 85%. It would fairly distribute the burden because most people buy electricity and most people buy gasoline. And it should be lower cost, fewer surprises, and much less complicated than what we have today. And I might add to that framework I just suggested, we would take whatever money was auctioned off in the cap and trade system, building up this, what I called slush fund. There'd be a smaller slush fund under a power plant cap and trade, but still a large one. We're talking about billions of dollars. That money would come right in and come right home and go right back home, right back to the taxpayers. It wouldn't stop. It would go right back to the people who paid the bill. Now, finally, Mr. President, how much time do I have remaining?
The senator has a minute and a half. Senator, I stand corrected. The senator has 4.5 minutes.
I thank the President. Finally, the best way to deal with this issue would be a different agenda. I would much prefer to see the Senate today be talking about clean energy independence, rather than the President asking the Saudis to drill for more oil, or the Democratic majority saying don't explore for oil but just raise taxes on gasoline 53%. I would rather see the Republican or the Democratic president work with the Congress and say, let's say to the world that we're going to launch a new Manhattan Project for clean energy independence. So within 5 years, we will be able to say to the world, we're going to be well on our way to saying to the Saudis, for example, we want to be your friends, but we can take or leave your oil. And the way to do that would be first to begin to do the things we know how to do to increase supply. For the next 30 years, we're going to use oil. It might as well be ours. Explore for oil offshore. Use it from the 2,000 acres in Alaska that's next to 13 million acres of wilderness. And then agree on 6 or 7 grand challenges, such as those I suggested at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory a couple of weeks ago, to give us a chance to make breakthroughs that would give us that kind of independence. Those would include making plug-in cars and trucks commonplace, a crash program for carbon recapture, for making solar costs equal or as low as fossil fuel costs, advanced research for biofuels from crops that we don't eat, more new green buildings, even fusion for the longer term. And Mr. President, I believe from the day the American president and the Congress announced to the world that we were engaged in a new Manhattan Project for clean energy independence that included both supply, demand, and research, that the rest of the world would change its way of thinking, that the speculators would get nervous, that the oil-producing countries would get real, that the price of gas would stabilize and eventually go down. And within 5 years, we would be well on our way to clean energy independence. That's the way to deal with high gas prices, high electric prices, and that's also the way to deal with clean air, climate change, and the national security implications of our overdependence on foreign oil. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.